Hey everyone, welcome back to the Echoes of Insight podcast. In this episode, I am joined by Mike Madden. He is a Christian apologist. Apologetics is basically defending your faith and talking about the evidence for the existence of God and whether Jesus Christ existed, whether he died, whether he rose from the dead or not. We go into that whole topic here. Mike is spent about a decade studying this stuff, and he brings all that knowledge in this short 45-minute podcast. So I hope you guys do enjoy this episode, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode when it comes out in the future. How'd you get into apologetics?
This is a really interesting story. You know, it's funny you should ask that question because
First, do you want to explain what apologetics is?
Yeah. So apologetics. Okay. So when we talk about apologetics, apologetics in general says to have an explanation or a justification for what you believe. So more specifically, I'm a Christian apologist. In fact, I just finished my degree at Houston Christian University, so I officially have a master's degree in apologetics. And what a Christian apologist does is there's actually a verse in the Bible. It's in 1 Peter 3:15, and it says, I'm just going to paraphrase it. It says, always have an explanation or a reason for the hope that you have in you. So it's pretty simple along those lines. So why did I become an apologist? It's kind of an interesting sordid story. I had an upbringing that was, I would consider, challenging in a lot of respects. My mother got divorced when I was quite young, and I'm the oldest of four kids in the family. And my last memory of my father was he tried to kill me. So I don't have to go into a lot of, like I said, I won't go into a lot of the sordid details of him, but my memories of him are things that inflicted either physical or mental pain on me. And so now we get to this idea of my family hauling me off to church, and I'm saying, why should I go and do this? And, what's this God the Father deal? It's like, I was abandoned by this guy who mistreated me. It's like, so why would I trust? What reason would I have for trusting a father that's supposed to be bigger and more magnanimous than the human person who was supposed to take care of me? So I'm going to tell you, to this day, I have an extraordinarily difficult time trusting in men. Women, I'm easy, which is which is good for my daughters, I guess, and my wife, so they can get whatever they want. My son, not so much. But all that stuff affects you, and I will say, in my family even, and I'll come back around to this in a moment. Even in my family, I'm the parent that's more likely to say yes, because I always felt like there wasn't that person there. So I think that's predisposed me to a particular behavior. Oh, I'm getting away from the mic.
No,
there you go. It predisposed me to a particular set of behaviors. Well, so I think God in his infinite wisdom kind of let me run through my life and kind of looking back on things now that I'm in my 60s, he gave me the opportunity to do a lot of things, and he protected me and he looked over me. He put just enough in place. But we got to the point where obviously any sort of personal gain I was making, I was getting promotions, you get more pay, you get a bigger house, you had a great family. It's like, clearly the reason for this is me, right? So you become very self-sufficient. You become very egotistical, even not necessarily without trying. So I've got this notion of I'm very standoffish to people coming into my circle, which kind of creates a hard persona, but I'm also making what I would consider to be earthly or professional gains in a good manner. So you feel pretty good about yourself. You kind of put your chest out, everything's hunky-dory. Look at me. I'm it, right? I am the American dream. Well, God in his infinite wisdom said, okay, you've run about as far as you can with that. So what he did at one point was basically pull the job right out from under me. So I literally went in a job, and this is like one of the worst things I ever went through. I went through a job where I went home for Christmas in January. They were absolutely thrilled with my performance. And 3 weeks later, they let me go for non-performance. Like, how does that happen? I still don't know how that happened. And the only reason I know how that happened is God saying, okay, enough of this stuff. You're a little too full of yourself. So I'm kind of sitting there. I'm sitting at home. I'm mid-50s, no job, no prospects for a job, knowing it's really hard to get a job at my age. This isn't going really well. Needless to say, I wasn't the most pleasant person to be around in my house. Thank God I have a great family. And I was just kind of, I was just stuck. It felt like the whole world was, all of a sudden you got bills due, there's no money coming in, you got no job, thing after thing after thing. And it was just this, the weight of the world got dropped on me. And really what that was is God bringing me down to my lowest moment where I had nothing to do but look at him. And I'm going to tell you, this is an absolute true story. I sat there one night and I said, I literally said, I don't know what else to do. God, make me who I'm supposed to be. And that was kind of like a breakthrough moment in things. And my wife said, okay, my wife's been a strong believer since she was quite young. She had me set up with a pastor, Matt Kaiser at Crossroads Church. He was the pastor at the time. We went through a lot of the issues I was struggling with, a lot of my neuroses, things like that, less than savory behaviors, and I said, okay, I'm kind of in on this Christian stuff. It makes sense. It makes me feel good. It's like it made sense at some level, but I'm in an I just felt good. Now, I don't have any basis for that. I just felt good. I felt like, okay, God was working in my, it's kind of a stupid way to say it. God doesn't work in anyone's favor. We respond to him, but it felt like he was responding to me. And then at some point, you might have experienced this, like going to youth group or something like this. You go and you have the, you kind of have the raise the roof. Let's have the pizza party. Let's stay up all night and get jacked up on Dr. Pepper or whatever we do. And it's a big emotional high. And then at some point you're like, is this stuff real? Is it not real? And for me, so now all of a sudden I'm stuck in this quandary. And the quandary is, I don't trust a single man in this planet, and I'm trusting the ultimate man, right? And so I don't want to be sexist about it, but God the Father, right? So I'm just ripping off the Bible on that point. So I'm really stuck on this point. So I'm trying to be all in at one point. All of a sudden I'm showing up at church, which I wouldn't go and do, following all the rules. I got baptized, I tithed, all that sort of stuff that you're supposed to go and do. I'm following the rules because, as my wife said, I can't do anything half in. If I'm in the pool all the way. I don't dip my toe. So I'm all in the pool, but I'm like, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what's going on right here, and is this stuff real or is it not real? So I started to poke around a little bit, and my wife had happened to leave me a copy at one point when she saw what a just a fool I was being. At one point, she left me a copy of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. So I'm just kind of sitting at home, and I'm all in this stuff, and I'm still thinking I'm not going to go and read this. Well, a couple of interesting things happened at that point. So I told you I got baptized. Now, here's a really interesting thing, and this is where I really, really got serious about all of it. So I got baptized on a Sunday in early January in 2013. That next day I got up, took a flight to Pittsburgh for work. don't feel good all day. In fact, I feel horrible all day. I just don't feel good. I feel like I'm worn down. Then I'm getting like these heart palpitations. So we're supposed to go out to dinner. I'm like, I don't think I can go out to dinner. I just don't feel good. You know, something's not right with my chest, blah, 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 blah. So someone said, geez, you know, we ought to take you to the hospital. I'm like, well, that's just kind of stupid. We're overdoing it here, aren't we? And so there's a local hospital, Allegheny Hospital, kind of out in the suburbs in Pittsburgh. And then there was the downtown hospital up, I think it's Pittsburgh Presbyterian Medical Center. And they're like, you know, if you're having a heart issue, you got to go there. I said, I'm not having a heart issue. I'm like, well, let's go anyway. Why? I don't know. So they wheel me in, and the person who brings me in goes, he may be having a heart attack. I'm like, what? Right, there's a person who's with me, and all of a sudden, you know, that the wheelchair comes out. You got to. They're just watching over me, paying all sorts of attention. You know, they jam me in a room, test. So I'm there for about 4 hours. Now, mind you, I'm supposed to be gone to dinner, back from dinner. I've called my wife at this point, and she has no idea any of this is going on. I'm just not calling. She's probably thinking, you know, he was probably out a little late. He'll call me tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Well, all the tests come back. They run these enzyme tests or whatever they're running, and they're like, you know, there's nothing really wrong with you, but while you're here, why don't you stay tomorrow morning, and we have a special stress test that we run here. I'm like, well, I don't know. So for whatever reason, I capitulate on the thing. Get up the next day. They get me on this treadmill. Mind you, I have a suit. I didn't have a tie, but I had a dress shirt, a suit, and dress pants, and I'm running on a treadmill. I'm surprised I didn't break an ankle. Anyway, so I run through the test, and they're like, and they're like, geez, you're doing pretty good. You're in pretty good shape, particularly for someone your age. Everything's really, really good. This seems kind of wasteful. We're just going to cool you down, and that'll be that. So they start to cool me down, and then they start looking at each other like this, you know, and all of a sudden they stop talking to me, and then they stop the test really fast, and they stick me in a room off on the side. I'm like, what's going on? They're like, we're going to get back to you in a couple of minutes. Well, a couple of minutes turns out to be a couple hours, and a cardiologist wanders in. You're like, okay, this can't be good. And he says, well, we saw something that looks like there might be something wrong. And we're not really sure what it is. And what we would like you to do is we would like you to take you into the cath lab and do an angiogram. So basically, I went from I'm perfectly healthy to you got to go in and see if my heart's running the right way. And so we did it. And I mean, this is just completely whirlwind. So I'm sitting in what's called a cath lab. It's, you know, it's like a mini little operating room, except they don't put you to sleep, and they start running wires inside you. And then there's a whole set of TV screens, and you're looking at your heart. And this is like surreal. It doesn't hurt, but it's pretty surreal, right? So the doctors, so the cardiologists like joking around, and they're like, no big deal. They went and looked at the right side of my heart. They always go right, left on this, as I found out later. Right side, no problem. They go to the left side. This is, you know, we're just going to be done in a couple minutes. And all of a sudden, it's like same as the test. They go, oh, can we get that camera angle a little bit different? So you never want. And then they look at me and they go, are you comfortable? You never want to hear in a cath lab like that, are you comfortable? That can't be a good thing. So short story comes out is the way the left side of your heart works, you have your aorta, and it's got this thing called a trunk, a left something trunk. I don't even remember the name. And then that breaks off into two main arteries on your heart. Well, it looked like I didn't have that trunk. And it looked like, and one of those two arteries are dominant, and it looked like the one that was dominant was actually partially closed up. So this is kind of a small problem, right? So come to find out that I have this defective heart. I've always had it, and it literally could have been what they said to me afterwards. You could have just stepped off a curb, and your heart would have just wouldn't have rebooted at one point, because I always got palpitations, and you'd be dead. Now, when we walked through, so short story is I had that all looked at. I ultimately went out to Cleveland Clinic, got a bypass, got the whole thing fixed. Now, why do I say that whole thing? All of this stuff got discovered when I spiritually gave my heart to God, gave my heart to Jesus, and the next day he revealed the physical problems with my heart. It was literally the next day. I'm like, are you kidding me? What are the odds of that happening? So still we get into apologetics and we're like, at some point you're like, coincidence, right? I mean, someone say to me, it was just coincidence. And your logical side says, it's coincidence. Well, being an engineer, at some point, I got to know if this is coincidence, if this is real, if this is not real. So now we get back to apologetics, 1 Peter 3:15. Is there evidence for anything that goes on here? So I started looking at apologetics videos, and that was kind of interesting. Didn't get me deep enough, but I kind of concluded that no matter how you look at things, there's a real basis that God exists. And we can say this from through all sorts of questions. We can say this from cosmological and astronomical questions. We start off with the idea of why is there not nothing? Because the universe in and of itself is not conducive to life. It just isn't. Well, before we even get to that is, why is there a universe? Did the universe create itself or did something create the universe? Right now we get to the idea of logically something has to be first. And so we're down to one of two things. Either something created the universe or the universe is eternal and or created itself. So the universe is inanimate. It's stupid in that regard, right? It just kind of runs. It does what it does. The universe has no brains. It just runs. So you kind of look at that and go, well, this thing that has no thoughts associated with self came into being. So what we're saying is nothing created something out of nothing. And that makes absolutely no sense at all. That's illogical. Now, the other option is to say, well, there was a thing before the universe, and this thing was incredibly powerful because it created the universe. It was incredibly knowledgeable. The ultimate knowledge, omniscient, is what we would say, because it knew how to create the universe. It had to make a personal decision to make the universe. So now all of it, and it had to precede time, space, and matter, which are the basic elements of the universe. So now when you start to go look at it, omnipotent, omniscient, all-powerful, outside of time, space, and matter, what do you get? Well, when you look at that, you start to get the definition of God, and you're saying, okay, that would be something created something out of what we would consider to be nothing. That seems like, boy, that's not a high probability. Well, I think that's a much greater probability than nothing. So right away I get to something, and that's kind of how the whole thing started, and we moved our way forward from there. So now if you go and look at that, then you can say, well, once we've got a reason that there's something, and that gets done in this thing called the Kalam cosmological argument. I won't go into the details, but that's basically what it says. Then we have another thing that would say, why is there not nothing? That's another argument. Then there's another argument. It's called the argument from fine tuning. And when we look at the universe, and I said earlier, the universe is not conducive to any life at all. Zero. On a probabilistic basis, we should not be having this conversation right now because we should not exist, which sounds kind of crazy. When you look at things like a gravitational constant, cosmological constants, there's all these different constants and initial conditions in the universe. If the universe expanded 1/1 trillionth slower than it did when it was created, it would have collapsed back on itself. It expanded 1/1 trillionth faster, it would have expanded too fast, and none of the right gases would have come together. There would have been no formation of stars and planets, right? So you kind of look at all these probabilities. If the gravitational constant was off to, I don't remember how many zeros, 30 zeros of precision from where it is now, there would be no life on Earth. So when you start to look at all these things, any one of these things has a probability of virtually zero of occurring, like just the gravitational constant or the cosmological constant, which says actually how fast is the universe expanding. It's still expanding, and this is the model that governs it. So when we look at all of these things together, when any one of them, there's 40 or 50 of these things at last count that I'm aware of, any one of them would say the probability of them is like zero. When you start to look at them all together, there is virtually no probability model that would suggest life should exist at all. So you're like, well, why does it exist? There's got to be a designer. So we start to work through that even more, and essentially you can kind of work through that, and then you can start to think about evolution and Darwinism and how just utterly ridiculous that actually is. So if you go back and think about what Darwin said himself, my theory is that everything evolved from one basically amoeba or single-celled sort of thing, and everything came out from that point forward. And at some point, the fossil record would suggest that that's what happened. Darwin himself said that. Well, since then, people have gotten way better than the late 1800s of understanding what's been going on in the fossil record. Come to find out, there are some basic sorts of things. The biggest being called the Cambrian explosion, when virtually all of the current life forms that exist all of a sudden came into play all at once. So it doesn't look like a tree that expanded out. It looks like a whole bunch of, I just hit that, sorry.
No,
a bunch
of I thought that was something on my
individual branches that came up. And while there's localized evolution, you have blonde hair, I have no hair, that sort of evolution.
You got some hair.
I got a little bit, but you get the idea. Or I have gray hair and you don't have any yet. So you get the idea. There's no notion of we evolved out of the same things as dogs, right? It just doesn't exist. So Darwinism, when you legitimately look at it, forget about what you get taught in science. It makes utterly no sense. There's no logical basis for it. So, and by the way, why would all these life forms emerge all at once? Why would they be seeded all at once? It's almost like someone planted them there. And you kind of go, isn't that odd? So what I'm doing is I'm making a cumulative argument for apologetics and why things would be true. And so then the next thing I kind of run down the path is the moral law. The moral law is my favorite because I think that's the most relevant law, the most relevant apologetics element for what's going on in the world today. So the moral law is really simple. It says if objective values and duties do not exist, then God doesn't exist. And really all that says is if God doesn't exist, there's no objective right, wrong, good or bad. In other words, everyone's got their own truth. Now, the next point then says objective moral values and duties do exist. For example, I think we could come to agreement really, really quickly that torturing babies is not a good thing.
Yeah.
So what is it? We don't have to argue about it. You inherently know this. Your parents probably never told you that, Joey, don't go out and torture babies today because it's a bad thing. You just knew not to go and do that. I'm pretty sure my parents never told me that. But I know not to go and do that because that would be really, really bad. So we know objective values and duties do exist. And then, so now we need an objective source of that. Because if we don't have an objective source of that, then we get into this thing called relativism. I always say it the wrong way. Relativism, which is basically, everyone's got their own version of the truth. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of see this in the world today in the way it works. It's just absolutely crazy in the way that things go on. And so in order for us to agree on anything along those lines, we've got to have an objective moral standard. There's got to be a single objective moral standard that we all center around. And when you think about what does that objective moral standard need to be? Well, one thing in particular has to be the ultimate good, has to be the good. By that, all things are measured. Well, what would be the ultimate good? Well, let's add it to those other things we talked about. So we've got omnipotent, omniscient, preceded time, space, and matter, made a personal decision to create the universe, and is the ultimate good, which means the ultimate love. Now, that's starting to sound like something to me, right? It's starting to sound like starting to sound like Christian God in my mind. So now I'm feeling like I'm getting somewhere. By the way, the moral law doesn't say that you have to believe in God. It just says that God has to exist. You can decide you don't like God or not, or you want to be an
Demons believe it.
atheist.
Demons know that
even,
God
even the
exists.
demons know, man. You're
Yeah.
right on that. That's a great point. So I think it's really important to understand that, and to have any level of conversation. This is what we have to go and do. And when you take God out of the equation, there's this really interesting model to an apologist, maybe not interesting to everyone who's listening, but there's this really interesting model, and you can kind of see how things get played through and how they get worked through when everyone's got their own opinion. So there's three elements of a model. It's called a theonomous culture, a heteronymous culture, and an autonomous culture. So at one point, we used to have more of a theonomous culture, which is all things came from God. We would look at God first. We would look maybe at the Bible first, what the Bible actually says, and we would base all of our decisions on that. God's natural laws, moral values and duties, right? I don't have to be a Christian. I don't have to read a Bible to know I don't go torture babies, right? There's a lot of people who aren't Christians who know don't go torture a baby, right? So that would be a theonomous culture. Now, I don't know, 100 and some odd years ago now, it started in Western Europe, we started to take God out of the school. It became a heteronymous culture. What that meant is essentially you got a government, you got a religious leader, you got a group of people who are making all the rules, right? It's the big man's making all the rules. And I don't mean the big man as in God. It's, it's more like the man's making the rules. It's, the big boss man, the bad person, the government, right? That those nasty people are making all the rules, and I should be able to decide. So what you do is you get protesters, and then you get a degree of freedom with making decisions, and I want to be able to make my decisions. You can make your own decisions, but I want to be able to make my decisions. Well, if we're all making our own decisions and we all decide what's right and wrong, that's called an autonomous culture. It's also called chaos. And you can kind of see that in the world today as things play their way through. And I would just kind of look at it like this. So what ends up happening, and this is a really interesting dynamic, is the people don't want to be oppressed anymore. Does that sound familiar at all? So then they all want to make their own decisions, and they want information to make their own decisions. They also want to determine what's right and wrong. So I want to do what I want to go and do, right up to the point where the thing that you want to do gets in my way. And when that happens, now I want to go back to a heteronymous culture because I want the government to put rules in place so I get my way and you don't get your way.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way the game gets played. So if we look at it right now, I just kind of look at what's going on all the campuses, right? With the Israeli protests that are going on. This is a really good kind of application of this. So it's a pretty simple game, right? There's the oppressors, which are the Israelis, right? So I'm a campus protester. So all you Israelis are all oppressors, and all these poor Palestinians are the oppressed. And what are we going to do? I'm going to go in my college and I'm going to demand you divest from everything Israel. You get out of doing anything that, any sort of, not deal with any Jewish people at all. I want things my way. I demand a ceasefire. I demand. I want my way because I'm right. And then what ends up happening? Well, when someone comes in and complains and gets in their face about something, what do? They run back to the government. They want the government to make rules, right? So in some respects, I can't tell you I'm the biggest Joe Biden fan, but Joe Biden's in a tough spot right here, right? He's kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't on this, right? But you start to see this really crazy dynamic that goes on. Everyone wants their way up to the point they're not getting their way. Then they want the government to decide for them. And if the government doesn't decide in their favor, then the government's nasty. We see the same thing in the way the Supreme Court gets treated, right? Supreme Court makes a decision along where your worldview lies. Man, these guys are the greatest thing since sliced bread. Supreme Court decides something that is not along what our worldview is. What a bunch of morons. Where did they go to law school, right? I mean, it's their law degree is probably written on a piece of Charmin, right? So you just think about things really, really differently. And the reason I bring this up is when you take God out of the equation, you keep playing this crazy heteronymous, autonomous game back and forth, and it just is this chaos that's in front of us. So at some point, I think God's going to come in and step in on that. So all of that, I guess, diatribe says, I have a basis for why God exists. Now, I can go back in a little bit more and start to look at this more from a Christian God perspective, right? So we could say, well, why not Allah? Why not Moroni and the Mormons, right? Why not any of those things? What makes more sense, kind of evidentially, as we go look at things? And if you look at that 1 Peter 3:15 thing, it talks about two things: reason, and it also talks about hope. Well, hope is a code word for this other thing that we like to use a lot. It's called faith. Now, faith is a leap. It's either a really big leap. So if you have blind faith, that's a massive leap, right? I don't know. What would be a good example of blind faith? I believe that I believe that I'm going to win $1 million tomorrow. The odds of that, not so much. Or you can believe something that's, you could have faith in something that you have no evidence for.
I mean, a lot of people have a blind faith when it comes to Christianity.
Yeah.
Because they don't do their research.
Exactly. You're spot on, Joey. One thing that came to mind when you said that is, typically, when people leave Christianity, it's when they leave high school. It's like they graduate from high school and they graduate from religion. And why? So you go to a campus, you get a secular background on that, and you all of a sudden you're being taught by this professor who's got degrees coming out of every orifice of his body. Sounds really, really smart and convicted in what they're doing, and they don't know jack. But they know a lot about their subject, but they don't know a lot about this, and they have no other evidence otherwise for what's going on. So when we talk about this, I kind of like thinking about this in two ways, and I think this is kind of fascinating. I'm probably going to do a paper on this at some point. But if we think about that progression to get to faith, I always think of do you ever hear the notion of the London Underground of mind the gap?
Mind the gap. I've heard of it, but I forget what it is.
Basically, it's if you ever go to the UK and you go to London, you ride the subway. There's always a sign. It's pretty famous. It's called Mind the Gap. Well, the gap is the amount of space between the platform where you're waiting to board and the train, right? So it's mind the gap. Don't step in the hole,
yes.
right? So when I think about faith, it's how big's my gap? Right? If it's blind, it's going to be really big. If it's well informed, it's going to be really small. A blind faith to me would be like trying to jump over the Grand Canyon. Could it happen? Probably not. Now, if I had to kind of step over a small puddle that's less than my gait, right? That's pretty easy to go and do. So I want to get as close to that as I can, but there's still a faith step involved with any religion with God. And really, as an apologist, what I want to do is I want to shrink your gap as small as I can. And the progression kind of looks like this. It actually comes from, I would say, the most famous apologist of all time, a guy named C.S. Lewis. Well, Lewis famously said that imagination is the organ of meaning, right? And that's a lot of philosophical words, but it basically says is anything that you're going to think about has got to have meaning to begin with. You imagine something to have meaning, right? So you're not married as far as I know. At least you weren't yesterday. So I don't know what happened this morning, but you weren't yesterday. So, but I think you would imagine what it's going to be like to be married. Now, there are things that'll influence you, like the way your parents are. You might say, boy, I want something just like my parents. Or you could say, I don't, that's the last thing I want. But you imagine what a marriage would be like. Or if you're going, even as something as simple as I'm going on vacation, you imagine what a vacation would be like. A trip around the lake where you live. I would imagine what tomorrow's trip around the lake's going to be. You're always imagining things, right? And so you're imagining those things and they have meaning. So I would tell you, like, even an atheist, God has meaning to an atheist. An atheist says, I don't believe in God. Well, based on what? That means you have to have thought of God and think he's not true. So everyone starts with this notion of they're imagining something that has meaning. And if it has meaning, that's part way down there. So now if I can get to meaning and it's important enough to me, then in theory, I should take the next step in Lewis's plan, which is to say, reason is the organ of truth. So I want to come up with reasons to find out whether this is true or not. So my apologetics progression is, for me, very long-winded way of getting here, which is, I said that prayer a long time ago, felt like it had meaning to me. Now I investigate all of these reasons, of which I've given you a bunch of them, and I land in a very particular place, which is to say, it's more probable than not that Christianity is true. Now, I'm being very precise on my words right here. I'm not going to tell anyone it is 100% true. And you're like, well, you're an idiot then. No, actually, I'm not. I'm being very truthful about it because there is no certainty. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I'm certain of is in 200 years, you and I will not be on this planet. I mean, I'm certain of that. Beyond death, I don't know what else is honestly certain. I mean, I'll give you a real trivial example I was working on. So if you're in an intersection, you're driving your car, you're in an intersection. You go through that intersection. Is it certain that you'll go through that intersection unscathed at any point in time?
No.
It never is, right? And you think about it. Even if I have a green light and I don't see anyone else coming, something still could go wrong in that intersection. Now, if I have a green light and no one's around, there's a pretty low probability something's going to go wrong. By the same token, if I'm on the opposite way from where I'm stopped, I have a red light, is a pretty busy road, and I decide to go, the probability of something going wrong is a lot higher. But I could still get through that, right? There may be cars spinning out all over the place. And, you've seen this in like a comedy movie with some cars spinning out. But there's no certainty on any of those things. So there is no certainty. So I don't want to mislead anyone on that point. But I think with the evidence here in Christianity, there is a very high probability that Jesus rose from the dead, and we'll go into that now. And if Jesus rose...
I have a question first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you heard of the Mandelbrot set?
The Mandelbrot, I have, but I don't remember offhand what it is.
I have a picture of it right here. Well, so it's an equation. Basically, it's a pretty simple equation.
What does it say?
I don't even know how to say it. I'll put a picture up on the video. But when it's mapped on the complex plane, which even that I don't really know what that means. It's a math thing.
Yeah.
It has infinite details. So this is the picture of it.
Yeah.
And if you zoom in, doesn't matter where you zoom in. We'll go right here. There's another Mandelbrot set here. And then if you go on certain places, there's infinite detail. So if we go on the edge here.
Yeah.
So a lot of people say that this is an argument for God, the existence of God, because this is something that exists, but it has infinite detail, and it's not like anyone finite created it.
That's right.
And I'm not the best at explaining that exact argument, but basically it's saying that it's something that's in our universe, but it's not from our universe because it's infinite.
Yeah.
And our universe is finite. And
That's
so it
right.
has to have a creator that is infinite, but is still in this universe,
Yeah.
Not from this universe, but in the universe.
Yeah. What you're describing is theism, right? So we have God that created the universe and is still active in the universe, right? As opposed to deism, which is God created the universe
and then kind of dipped,
wound it up like an alarm clock and just going to let it run out. And he's not doing anything. And so some people think that explains all the chaos in the world. I don't think it does, but there's some people who think really, really clearly about that. The other way I could go with that, by the way, was as people like Crick have discovered DNA, and they start to get into the level of depth and the complexity of DNA. The DNA complexity is equivalent to the complexity in the universe. So now here's another example of you can't make this stuff up. The probability of there even being one cell is so astronomical. Forget about a complex life form. It's so astronomical that you just have a hard time saying, could the universe exist without God? I'll go back to my certainty point. I'm not certain but there's a really, really high probability going on that things are pretty good here and I'm on the right track if you go and look at it. So we kind of go back and say, I think for most people who don't believe in Christianity, that they've got a couple of issues going on. Some of them are educational issues, right? I would say the kid who gets out of high school, goes to college, and gets talked out of it. Apologist Frank Turek would say because they were never talked into it. In other words, they were never given apologetics training. So there's an educational issue that goes along with that. There is also, I think, a volitional issue that goes into place. In other words, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want that to be true. I don't want someone else to control my life. There's a secular philosopher, very famous, his name is Thomas Nagel out of New York University, right? And he's very adamant about writing stuff that I don't care what you tell me. I don't want there to be a God. That's a volitional issue. And then there's also then emotional issues. This tends to go with pain and suffering. So someone has suffered really badly, maybe a loss of a spouse or something really, really bad has happened. Somebody close to them died, somebody gets cancer or something along those lines, and they get really, really angry at God. And that anger often presents itself intellectually, but there's that emotional problem. So emotional, intellectual, or volitional tends to be the things that get in the way. But those are all transitory things about how we're feeling. So when we sit and look at the problem in Christianity, it's pretty interesting, right? So I've given you a whole lot of basis for God, but at the end of the day, if Jesus didn't rise from the sins, the whole thing's BS, in my opinion.
Well, yes.
so there's just small little detail there that we need to cover, and I kind of like this. So it's like if you read 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's 15:14. So chapter 15, verse 14. It basically, Paul comes up and says, hey, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then our faith is completely worthless. To me, right, if we're talking about, as Christians and in general, if we're talking about the Bible as divinely inspired, that's God saying, take me out for a test drive. Take me out for a test drive. I got proof. I'm pretty good on this point, and I kind of like that. And so, anyone who's thinking about Christianity, by the way, should start by reading 1 Corinthians 15. It basically gives you the whole shooting match all in one thing. And, we could probably do a whole podcast simply on 1 Corinthians 15. I think it is just absolutely remarkable. But we're going to get to evidentially, depending on who I look at, I can say there are between 3 and 6 historical bedrock facts that can only be answered by resurrection. So that's kind of cool to think about. I'll just go, I guess for time constraints, I'll do 3 because all I need are 3.
Sure. Go ahead.
So the first one is Jesus died by crucifixion. Actually, not a lot of people question this. Any sort of scholar with any significant degree at all, whether they are Christian or non-Christian, will agree that Jesus died by crucifixion for a lot of different reasons. First off, what the Gospels say. There's a lot of consistency in the Gospels. There's also a lot of extra biblical attestation for this. In other words, a whole bunch of guys who were not Christians, who were either uninterested or hostile parties, there's a Jewish scholar, Josephus, that gets referred to a lot. There's Tacitus. These people actually wrote about crucifixion. They wrote about specifically Jesus' crucifixion. So the number of sources that we have are pretty broad in nature when we consider what's available in antiquity. Also, early church fathers, they're called largely apostolic fathers, which is kind of goofy, but it's the guys after the disciples. It's like after Peter's out, John's out. So it becomes guys like Polycarp and Clement and Origen. Origen's a little bit later, Papias. So there's a whole group of guys that also write about this stuff. So the number of sources that would suggest Jesus died by crucifixion is pretty impressive. And there's really no serious scholar, even liberal skeptics, atheists will agree he did. So I kind of like that one. So I can put that one in my back pocket. The next one that's interesting is almost immediately after Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples had experiences they believed were the risen Jesus. So again, I'm being very precise in my words. I'm not saying they saw the risen Jesus. I'm saying they had experiences they believed to be true. And this is really important to go and think about. So first off, when did they start doing that? They didn't get together and write the Harry Potter series and figure this sort of stuff out over a window of time. They literally went from they're scattered. He was supposed to be the Messiah. He's gone. This is not going the way that anything that they've ever thought about or experienced was supposed to go. There's nothing in Jewish literature. There's nothing in Jewish lore. There's nothing in any sort of local early Palestinian writings on any scroll that would suggest he should have been crucified. So all of a sudden, they're saying, hey, we saw that Jesus, he rose from the dead, and they're doing it in Pentecost, which is, only a few weeks after Passover. So there's not a lot of time to sit there and write this creative thing that no one's ever invented before. So they're running around basically giving their life to saying Jesus rose from the dead. And you kind of go, well, okay, they could be making it up. I would kind of debate that for one reason. None of them ever changed their minds, and virtually all of them were killed for their belief. And I think this is a really important thing. And this gets listed out. Everyone who saw the risen Jesus, by the way, I go back to 1 Corinthians 15 and 3 through 8, it will tell you. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to Paul. He appeared to the 500. He appeared to all the disciples. I'm a little bit out of order here, but he made multiple appearances and Paul's response in all of this was he wrote that book while these people were still alive, so they could refute it if it wasn't true. So we have that piece of evidence there. Again, scholarship would say they are certain that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. So it's not a question of who wrote the book. They know it's his writing, it's in his hand, and there's a lot of corroboration with those points. So we know who saw Jesus live, the risen Jesus walking around. We know they changed their life. We know they were martyred for that point. And here's something that's really interesting that I think we should be considering in this model. They died for what they knew to be true. They saw the risen Jesus. And so people say, well, what's the difference between them and the guys, the nutty guys who flew planes into the Twin Towers? Well, there's a huge difference in that. Those guys were told by somebody else and trained that what Allah said was true. They didn't see Allah. They didn't get the Quran directly spoken to by them. They didn't see Muhammad. They didn't see any. They were told. They were trained, right? So they died for what they believed to be true. Disciples died for what they knew to be true, right? And there's this saying that goes along with this, right? Martyrs make bad liars.
Right.
So when you think about that, so that's the second reason. And then the third reason then becomes Paul. So we have Paul, who's this dude called Saul. He's a Pharisee. He's running around beating the tar, killing Christians because he is such a zealous Jew that he cannot tolerate this apostasy that's running around, and he's gonna wipe these Christians off the face of the earth. And I think most people know the stories. Paul's on the road to Damascus, and all of a sudden, bright light shows up. All the guys around him are kind of blind, and Jesus says to Paul, "Hey, what are you doing? What are you doing to my people here?" And Paul's like, "Who are you, Lord?" And he kind of figures out he's Jesus. Well, Paul goes off and becomes the author of the vast majority of the New Testament at that point. So there's no question that his writings are agreed to by scholarship. What he did, how he lived, how he died, all of that was true. So Paul, much like the other disciples, was martyred for all of his beliefs. Now, what's really interesting about Paul on top of that is he is the only person in any major religion who has a direct citing of God that's written in his hand.
Mm.
It's not true in Islam. It's not true in Mormonism. It's not true in Hinduism. It's not true in anything else at all. So we know what he believed. He died for that to be true. And so now we want to go and try to explain these 3 points. So Paul believes he saw the risen Jesus. The disciples believe they saw the risen Jesus. There's a historical record that says Jesus was crucified. It's highly likely the tomb was empty. So how do you explain all of these sort of things? Well, one way to explain it is Jesus was raised from the dead. Okay, so I mean, as a Christian, you know that's going to be my answer. Now, when we look at this from an evidential perspective, right, we have to say, well, if that wasn't the case, if that's not the likely case, then what is the answer? And you can't just say, well, I just don't believe in miracles, so it couldn't happen, right? Talk about a lame answer. So what you're saying is, no matter what I tell you, you don't want to open your eyes to the evidence that's in front of you and come up with a plausible explanation. And I'm saying, look at the evidence. If you want to look at that evidence and come up with a better answer, God bless you, because now you'd be able to do something that no one's been able to do for 2,000 years. So I think that would be something I would want to go and hear. I don't think you can. And I'll just give you an example, Joe, is the number one alternative, the natural alternative, right? There's no God, so there's no supernatural, so there's no miracles. And that's actually the biggest problem with all of this stuff when people look at the evidence is they'll have a worldview or a horizon that says, I only believe in naturalism. I don't believe in supernaturalism. Therefore, miracles can't occur. Therefore, Jesus can't rise from the dead. And then they build their argument from that. So they know the end game, and then they waterboard the facts to get to their answer. It's a nice Muslim trick. They like to do that too with a lot of things that they have. So the alternative we come up with, though, is hallucination theory. This is absolutely brilliant. So when you go and you ask anyone about hallucinations, now let's look at this first off. So when you consider all the people in 1 Corinthians 15 that saw the risen Jesus, what we need to have are group hallucinations with different people in different places at different times. Now, there is no record at all there, and there's no scientific basis for a shared group hallucination. Not one in all of history, yet we had to have half a dozen of these things, all with different people, all seeing the same thing, all seeing Jesus the same way. So that seems kind of silly.
Yeah.
So I'm having a hard time with that one right away. So group hallucinations. Okay. Then someone will come back, well, particularly the individual disciples were suffering from grief hallucinations. I could get my head wrapped around that in and of itself. That's a fair statement. However, only 7% of people actually have hallucinations in general, and only a small fraction of those are visual hallucinations. So now just think of the one occurrence where Jesus shows up in the upper room. So I would say the 12, but it's really 11 because Judas wasn't invited to that scene. So we got 11 guys hanging out there once they get Thomas back in there, all seeing the same thing, all having a shared grief hallucination, and it's visual, which doesn't exist very often. And oh, by the way, this all small other thing is Thomas touched him, right? So they got a record of Thomas touching him. So are you touching a vision? I don't know how you touch a vision, right? So that becomes a little bit of a challenge on top of itself. So that strikes me as it's really, really goofy. So when we start to look at hallucinations overall, there's no medical basis for anything that's going on. So there's no correspondence to say they could be true. There's no notion of group hallucinations. There's no notion of group hallucinations in multiple places at multiple times. And oh, by the way, one other small fact is Jesus also cooked fish, ate, and serve these guys breakfast on top of that. And again, I don't think an apparition or a vision is going to be able to go and do that. That's just my belief. Maybe your mileage is different on that. So when we start to look at the alternatives, and this is the best alternative, by the way, I don't know how you can suggest that a hallucination is true. So no one has ever been able to come up with an alternative that's better than the resurrection. The only answer we'll get is, well, I've never seen a miracle, therefore miracles can't be true, which is a logical fallacy in and of itself, right? So just because, have you ever seen $1 million in front of you?
No.
Does $1 million exist, right? I'm kind of doing the Santa Claus thing,
A little
right?
bit more than 1 million exists.
Right, exactly. And so I've never seen it, but I have a basis for believing it true. Just because you haven't seen the miracle, and by the way, to say miracles don't exist would mean you would have to know all occurrences of all things since the beginning of time on earth and know that there was never a miracle anywhere at any point in time. Because if there's one miracle, then there's a possibility for a second miracle. And then I'll end it on that point, which is, again, the very fact that you and I are talking to each other is the proof of a miracle. Not that we're wonderful, magnanimous people, but the fact that there's a universe is a miracle. So any life beyond that is an absolute miracle. So when people say, I've never seen a miracle, it's like you're the actor in a play and you're saying, I don't get the context outside of the play. You're living in the miracle.
Right.
So when all of this comes back is, I needed to know this stuff was evidentially true. And there's a lot more we can go to. There's just some really amazing, brilliant people that have written on this. Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, Richard Bauckham. I could go on and on with a number of different people. There's a new guy emerging that was a Gary Habermas sort of disciple. His name's Ben Shaw. He's doing this thing called core apologetics that I think is incredibly interesting. There's a lot of evidence for this, and there's not another religion that can come close to proving that. So, is Christianity true? Certainly. I can't say that, but I can tell you there's a high probability it's true, and I've given you a lot of reasons. So what I've done is I've shrunk the faith gap down, and now I can say, well, if Jesus rose from the dead, the most likely answer to that is something supernatural, which would have to be God, and I gave you other reasons for God. So now, can I have faith that Jesus died for my sins? I think that's a pretty good bet at that point. I think it's a fantastic bet at that point. And oh, by the way, what's the alternative? 50, 60, 70, 80 years, maybe we live for a long time, we get 100 years, we're in a box, it's over. I mean, just think how depressing that is. What are you having to look forward to? So anyway, I think that the evidence would suggest that Jesus was raised from the dead. The only plausible answer for that is God. That makes my faith gap really, really small. It's like taking a small step for me, and I have a lot of faith that Jesus died for my sins. He died for your sins, and anyone who's listened to this, he died for their sins as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Joe. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. I hope this is of value to someone. If one person just looks at this and says, "I'm going to give Christianity a try," man, that will have made my year.
I hope for more.
All right.
This is an evergreen thing, so I am hoping that one day when I get a lot more eyes on me, people will look back at this, and it'll affect more people than it will right now.
I hope so. There's our 1 Peter 3:15, right? It's the Great Commission. So, we just want to bring some of you guys along for the ride with us.
It's a great time. All right.
Thanks,
Talk
Joe.
To you later, guys. Thank you for watching. If you did enjoy and you find yourself coming back on the regular, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you never miss a full episode when it comes out. These are going to be coming out every week, and you don't want to miss them. There's a lot of knowledge and stuff. If you want to watch another episode, go to the left of your screen right there. You can click it. If you're watching on a TV, you're not going to be able to click it, but that's okay. So thank you again for sticking by and watching till the end, and I will see you next time.